I've got a few thanks to say, actually. So the first one I want to say is to our sponsors. Okay? Last year, as I mentioned in a general meeting throughout last 2017, ISITC actually paid for everything here, apart from two sponsors. We had DTCC and Volante last year. So I was really pleased that Rob Scott did a fantastic job in getting the sponsors to come along, number one, and it's actually drawn a lot more of the crowd. And we've got some fantastic speakers for you today. So I really want to say thank you to Accenture, Broadridge, Cognizant, Torsten, and Volante, okay, for your assistance. This is for 2016, so it's always a year in arrears because we closed the year out in 2017, and we'll show those next year. As I said last year, it was a year of rediscovery investment. Membership numbers increased 100%. They're pretty stable this year, a little bit more, a little bit higher, and we've got some excellent members. You don't, as I always say, you don't have to be members, but it shows commitment and actually willing to actually fund the actual organisation itself, because we don't get any other funding, as you know. The working groups were well attended in 2016. 2017, different step change. Okay, we modernised the whole of ISITC Europe to make it more effective in terms of what we can actually deliver for you as members and you as participants. We've got great video recording now. Okay, we have 3 meetings a year. We have an AGM. We have 2 general meetings. They're all available free of charge on our website for people to look at. Okay, and there's some great debates on there as well. In terms of expansion, we have the ISITC Europe Academic Forum created, and there's some great news, as you'll hear later on throughout the day, on what that's going to achieve in 2018. Also, the partnership with the CISI, the Security Institute, as well, not only the cameraman, but also George Littlejohn has done a fantastic job in encouraging its members to actually come to our meetings. Okay? And hopefully, those that are first here, you actually enjoy what you're actually hearing, and you actually participate in what we're actually doing. We also had some recognition in terms of participation on industry level, not only the T2S DLT meeting in Frankfurt that Gary Wright and I attended, but also others where we're actually working with the BSI, for example, the British Standards Institute. Okay, so it's great to actually see that evolving. And the net from last year is about £1,000, even though we've actually invested a lot of the infrastructure. For those that aren't familiar with ISITC, what we basically do is we actually learn a whole process of collaboration. Why do we collaborate? And these are just some highlights of why we actually should be collaborating. Not only from a business perspective, and there's certain groups around the world, SMPG, etc., who do the same thing, FIX, etc. We'll work with those guys. Okay, we have no problem. We don't mind, stepping on people's toes is not what our job is. It's actually to exchange information and views. The benefit, of course, is that we actually come an understanding of how things can actually be moved forward, particularly in change, okay, and how we can actually, what does that mean for us as a community? So your participation is most important for us to actually do that coverage. So the backdrop as well, in terms of the way in which the world is changing. So there's a few examples on here. Political change, okay, regulatory change, technology change, in fact, market infrastructure change. The market infrastructure change both on the trading side and on the settlement and clearing side has actually impacted the way in which we operate. I'm a custodian bank. I do certain things a different way than I did 5 or 6 years ago. Okay? And we're all going to be doing the same thing. Fund managers are going to be doing something different as well. And as you'll hear from the fund management, the investor panel today, there's different things that are coming out of that whole arena there in terms of innovation. So we actually pull that in, and we have a whole collection. Anyone can be a member or participate in ISITC Europe. Okay? So academia, fund managers, custodian, broker-dealers, the whole range in terms of vendors as well, of course, and consultants. Okay? Individuals as well. We have a number of individuals that actually participate at the group levels as well. The governance model, this needs to be updated because Fiona Hamilton has now just joined us on the Standards and Data Group. Okay, we're renaming it Standards and Data because it's an important area, and we'll be talking about that, I'm sure, throughout the technology debates today. Rob Scott is still the advisor, but I'm really looking forward to helping Rob with myself next year, how we actually push that one forward as well for a group level. John Gavin, Rob Morrill, Gary Wright, Tony Kirby, Chad Gisani, Paul Baber, and Martin Sexton. So the group is offering their services for free from a voluntary perspective, and really is looking for you guys to also contribute. So hopefully you'll see some areas that you feel that you can actually contribute, so we can actually work that whole thing together. The other thing that we're actually currently doing is working much closely with NAM, which is North America, ISITC North America. If you probably don't know the history, some of you, North America was the first ISITC, and that was in 1991. We actually pulled together in 92 because the guys came over from the US and we set up ISITC in Europe. So much, much closer working with the guys in North America and how we can align the same areas of interest. So how do we actually do it? Well, we work with trade associations and universities, okay? CISI is an example, the universities that we're actually working with, and you'll hear more about that as we go through the day. We also debate the solutions and support those solutions, okay? So we actually want to make sure that there's a common issue that we all need to have a resolution or more understanding of, okay? We can actually break that down to the level. We work with the Standards Association. We're not a standards body, okay? Slightly different to the North American, which are a standards body in the US as well as an industry association. We actually want to contribute to that whole discussion and debate, okay? And that's where we actually sit, bang in the middle of that whole area. As I said before, we have 2 general meetings and 1 AGM per year. And we intend to do that same thing again this year, of course. First time I met Keith was when I joined IBM. In year 1999, I believe, November 1999. He was one of the first people I actually met at IBM, and that's the reason why he's great. Okay? But we've actually been friends now since that period of time, okay? And it's my pleasure to actually advise you as an audience. Keith's got an encyclopedic knowledge of every single thing that he's done at IBM. He's got a fantastic knowledge of business, he's got a fantastic knowledge of technology, and innovation as well. So it's my pleasure if you can welcome Keith Bear to the stand, please.
Okay, I've obviously been set a pretty difficult challenge by Nigel in terms of talking about the new industry models. So what I'm trying to do is talk about some key themes which I think are happening at the moment, flavors of disruption, and some suggestions in terms of some of the reactions that may be appropriate given this. So I've obviously got quite a wide remit as far as the title is concerned. So I'll be spending the next 30 minutes talking a bit about the context as I see it, some of the drivers for disruption, which are one of the reasons why I think the new model is a topic to discuss in this context, and then how to live long and prosper given that environment. And for those of you who are fans of Star Trek, that's the Vulcan for love and prosper, apparently. So hopefully that serves you well. I've pinched a couple of slides from McKinsey. We are a client of McKinsey, so I'm hoping they won't complain too much. But it's not a bad indication, I think, in terms of the state of the industry at the moment. Many of you from financial institutions, I think, are well aware of the challenges of pressure on ROE as a result of regulatory change, operating cost, etc. I won't dwell in it. But I think most people would agree this continues to be a challenge, and that is one of the background factors as to why discussing where the new models may be is an important question for us. Secondly, innovation. I mean, obviously, we have this challenge at the moment between the incumbents and how quickly they can move. A lot of people represented in the audience here, and also new ways of doing things, new fintechs, new technologies. It has a significant impact given the investment that's going into fintechs, as you can see. Just in the retail space, the amount of loans that are being facilitated by non-banks at the moment, $4 trillion is a big number. And also the cost models that are potentially in place in certain areas of the industry which potentially can give opportunities for disintermediation, and we'll get on to that a bit more specifically in the financial markets in a few slides' time. And then finally, technology, obviously, we all know the importance of technology within financial markets. Again, from McKinsey, this just gives an illustration on the, if you like, the dependence on technology and the dependence on technology investment across lines of business within the financial markets. Again, no big surprises probably in terms of where those are, other than the fact that Mickey Mouse seems to have made an entrance in the top right there. But it's illustrative, I think, of just how important technology is, and therefore the things that are coming down the line as regards technology are having a big impact. And we shouldn't take for granted that means that market structures, roles of market participants are going to stay as they are. Most obvious one that's obviously having a lot of debate at the moment is blockchain, but it's not by any means restricted to that, as I'll try and say a little later. So the 4 kind of topics I was going to touch on in terms of disruption. Obviously, I'm taking a bit of a technology flavor to this because in the space of 30 minutes, I can't get too much into the other business-oriented disruption factors as well, but just taking these four as a starting point. So firstly, around quantum, I mean, that's been in the news a little recently. Blockchain, obviously, again, I won't dwell on it because there have been many sessions at ISITC and elsewhere as far as that's concerned, but it's worth including, I think, in this kind of context. Obviously, AI and cognitive, and I'll try and give some examples of where that may be heading as well. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, fintechs and the way that may disrupt the future market. So first of all, quantum. I'm sure everybody's heard of it. You may not fully appreciate why it's as important as it is. I think many of you would be familiar with the story of, allegedly the guy who invented chess in terms of having a reward from one of the leaders in India where it happened was putting grains of rice on a chessboard and doubling on every square. And this is essentially a model for quantum computing, comparing it to what happens with conventional computers. Because if you double every grain of rice in this particular case, by the time you get to the 64th square, you lay those grains of rice end to end and you can go to Alpha Centauri and back. It's a very, very big number. And basically, that's essentially what we're seeing exponentially with the growth in terms of what quantum computing will do as opposed to conventional 0 and 1 binary-based computing systems. So it's fundamentally different in terms of where the potential is, and that has ramifications in many areas, as illustrated by this. So Google, IBM, of course, are doing a significant amount of investment research. This is the IBM quantum computer on the right-hand side. Not the sort of thing you're going to stick under your desk, because it actually operates at 15 millikelvin, so minus 272 point whatever degrees centigrade. And for that kind of reason, we're obviously talking about a lab-based environment. Typically, these things are going to get accessed over the cloud. For those of you who have an interest, want to play, you can, in our network, you can just go onto our website and start programming a quantum computer just to get a flavor of what it means in practice. Obviously, the number of qubits, the quantum bits, is relatively limited here, but we're now already on the IBM side and also Google up to the 50 qubit kind of range. And going back to my earlier point, the reason why this is important, if you imagine you have 4 playing cards, one of them is the queen and the others aren't, and you have to find out which one is the queen. You start turning cards over. If the first card is a queen, then it's taken 1 turn. If it isn't, then you know it's one of the other 3. And on average, it'll take you about 2.5 turns of cards, roughly, in order to find the queen in that situation. For a quantum computer, it does it in one go, because essentially quantum superposition means you can be a 0 or a 1 or anything in between in terms of bits. So it's essentially the technology. So that's why this scaling exponentially is so important. And as you can see, that's why understanding how to program it, understanding the kind of problems that apply to it is really important. The work that's going on at the moment, obviously you can see hedge funds, for example, exploring the technology, understanding what it means in terms of optimization problems, valuation models, all the things, the compute problems that you can't do with physical, conventional computers, zeros and ones, which you can do with quantum. Basically, there are new algorithms that quantum can support, which basically means new ways of doing risk modeling, etc. So the impact of that over the next couple of years is going to start being telling, and that's kind of illustrative of the fact of the work in our case that we're doing with JP Morgan and Barclays, for example, to explore where those use cases are and what the impact will be within the financial markets world. Secondly, blockchain. I mean, this is from Goldman Sachs reports, and you may be familiar with it, but from a couple of years ago, but it does give an illustration of why it's important. If the number is true, 11 to 12 billion annual cost savings just from the cash securities world globally, then that doesn't come about with a lot of disruption to facilitate those kinds of savings. So shouldn't assume that the market participants and the market structure that we have will stay exactly the same when potentially large numbers of repeated processes and duplicate ledgers, etc., how that can be realized as far as new market structures in a new world to realize those kinds of savings. And just in terms of what's going on at the moment, this is a cross-section of what's going on within the industry. Obviously, quite a lot of the work that we're doing, but also others. So ASX and their decision to implement DAH is obviously a landmark, I think, in terms of applicability of blockchain technology into the clearing and settlement space. Closer to home, we have significant examples. Maybe Hugh will touch on the work we're doing at Borsa Italiana, for example, Critically, I think DTCC and CLS, two globally systemically important market utilities, both going live this year with blockchain-based applications. In the case of DTCC, as you may know, the replacement for the Trade Information Warehouse, which is going into production, into industry testing, I should say, in around July or so this year, and implemented by the end of this year. CLS going into production hopefully in April, subject to the regulators, which will be for CLS netting of non-CLS eligible currencies. So again, major statements in terms of blockchain technology maturity that for these heavily regulated institutions that they will be putting out pretty mission critical applications into the market based on blockchain. And we have probably the most interesting example in many respects is the Japanese exchange group. So they formed a consortium, as you may be aware, 23 different firms, including 33 different firms now, it's gone up, including the Japanese FSA, the Bank of Japan, etc. Not necessarily to do what ASX are doing to implement a blockchain environment for clearing and settlement, but to build a consensus effort across the whole of the Japanese market to understand what the impact would be, what does it take to operate a blockchain-based network, and to build that joint understanding across the whole of the market as to how this will be delivered in practice. And we hosted the FSA, UK FSA in Japan to give them a briefing on that just Monday this week, in fact. So I think a lot of what's going on globally within blockchain, again, many of you know this, will be very significant, I think, over the next year or two, in particular when some of these major implementations like ASX, DTCC, and CLS are in production, and the lessons learned from that, I think, will have a significant impact. But it's also a source of disruption. I mean, I've just picked this example from SynSwap, but disruption isn't just internally from the incumbents, and they've been at the forefront of that change, which is the philosophy between DTCC and CLS, but also the fintechs and the roles that they can play. So SynSwap going into POC a little later this year to explore what their model could mean, and that obviously has risk of existing incumbents within, in this case, the derivatives world, to being potentially displaced. So I don't think anyone, as I'll come on to a little later, can take anything for granted, given what the technologies can do, given what the appetite for change may be, given a number of other factors as well. And just an example, just to step outside of the financial markets world for a moment, this is another illustration of how change can come about without having a central market operator like a DTCC or CLS driving that change. And WeTrade, which is in the SME trade finance area, now a total of 9 banks. We hope there'll be many other banks joining through towards the end of this year. And essentially that's now formed as a consortium, a joint venture, and open to other banks to join to basically facilitate SME trade finance, basically allow SMEs to get a bank credit for where they might not otherwise be able to do so because of the trust and transparency that's being delivered by all banks being on a common blockchain network, and all state of the transaction from the supply to the buying to the payment to the KYC of SMEs, etc., all being reflected on the blockchain environment. So essentially that is laying down tracks for a new blockchain-based network across, in this case, continental Europe, and you can start seeing that will potentially change market structure in the trade finance world. Obviously there are other consortia as well. Who's going to win the land grab is very interesting, but this is due to go live in April this year, so again, I think first mover advantage will be a significant factor. And if that's happening in trade finance with peer organizations coming together as opposed to a central market operator, then I think that will be pretty interesting to understand how that model may be used in the financial markets environment as well. So there's a lot of interest, I think, in terms of how peer collaboration may have an impact, as well as the central market operators, to some extent protecting their incumbent positions as a result of being at the forefront of disruption. And can hardly talk about blockchain without talking about crypto assets, and some of you have seen this chart. And you have experience, from a personal or a commercial point of view, the kind of increase that we've already seen in digital assets. So obviously there's a lot of debate as to what extent crypto assets will become a real asset class in the institutional investment kind of context. If it does, then it's a whole new world, I would suggest. Does an existing global custodian want to be a custodian for crypto assets, for example? We're already seeing the CME, CBOE, etc., providing clearing for Bitcoin. We're seeing ETFs being started, then being stopped by the SEC. So there's a significant amount of change at the moment And if this is a market opportunity that firms want to get into, it's going to be a different set of rules to the conventional legacy financial markets, if you like. So understanding what the crypto asset impact is going to be and deciding how to play, I think, is a key debate as far as the new model is concerned. AI and cognitive. I think there's a widening open jaws at the moment between the amount of data. Somebody was telling me the other day, if you look at the data that's generated by a single trader, within a week it's petabytes of data when you add up the voice and all the other information sources, structured and unstructured, that kind of get generated. And obviously as we get into conduct and surveillance, risk and surveillance, you understand that there's a greater need to understand and interpret data like that. So the means by which technology can understand and analyze and leverage information gets more and more required, and the gap potentially is quite great. So the question is, how can this be realized? And again, it's obviously a subject in its own right to get into detail on machine learning and AI. And they will, just to give an example, this is an investment analysis kind of use case. So this is what a typical investment analyst may be spending his or her time on. And as you can see, the vast majority of that is a question of research, triaging of news, generating investment hypotheses, creating financial models, validating analysis as a result, that sort of thing. Then finally, fintechs, as I mentioned, which I think is a really good quote to symbolize some of the challenges at the moment. I've mentioned a couple of examples already. There are obviously many, many more. We're probably taking for granted that most of the fintech innovation is in the retail banking space around payments, peer-to-peer lending, etc. But just like the example I mentioned earlier, I think there are an increasing number coming in. I haven't got the chart, but there are actually hundreds that are actually focused globally on capital markets, so nothing could be taken for granted, and therefore understanding what the impact is a key requirement. And as I said, not taking anything for granted. So CB Insights, I think, had this very interesting perspective of the number of firms around in 2006, the top firms within the, based on market cap. I'm sorry, Nigel, for Citi dropping off this list. But we're no surprises as to where the largest firms by market cap are. And as I said, the number of companies that have disappeared over the number of years is shortening all the time in terms of the longevity of companies. History tells us that you can't take anything for granted with the rate of disruption that's going on at the moment. Another example of this is, I mentioned fintechs already in terms of the new entrants coming in. And again, you may have seen this chart before, but it gives no, I think there's a significant questions to be asked as to what the impact may be, because I don't think we can take for granted that we won't see the same disruption that other industries have seen. And you may have seen the quotes on one of the most popular phrases to come out of investor speeches by corporates at the moment as they give their earnings review is to be Amazoned or Amazon. So that name is being reflected time and time again as a risk to existing business models. I'm not picking on Amazon particularly, but obviously they have some significant strengths across market, technology, the client relationship, etc., which I don't think anyone could take for granted in terms of where that kind of model can have an impact in what we take for granted in the current infrastructure. So pulling all of that together, what does it actually mean? And how do you, going back to my opening phrase, how do you survive and prosper when there's a potential disaster sitting above your head? I mean, I'm being a little over-dramatic maybe, but that's really to make the point. I think that's quite a good graphic, I think. So this was a quote I heard from a custodian, which was quite interesting, I think, of what's going on at the moment. This was in a kind of blockchain context, but if you look at what we take for granted in a very simplistic view of trade life cycle, ultimately, when you have a distributed ledger that could have the same ledger across all four elements of those market participants, how many chairs do you need at the end for market structure? Because it probably isn't four. So who's going to be the guy without the chair, and what impact will that have in that respect? And the other thing, telling comment, and again, thank you to CB Insights for this, is this quote from Hemingway in terms of 2 ways of going bankrupt gradually and suddenly. And I don't know if you can recognize the unfortunate company on the bottom right. Any guys who want to suggest who that was? So this was actually BlackBerry. So, they had a period of 21 months when there was a gradual decline, and then, very sudden decline. So, the question to ask yourselves are you in that gradual phase at the moment? By definition, you're not in the sudden phase, but are you in the gradual phase? In which case, understanding what to do is a key element. And there's no easy answer to this, obviously, but other than looking at one's business, looking at one's clients, looking at the market that one operates within, in all these kinds of contexts at the front end and the way that AI, technology, etc., can impact what I was talking about a little earlier, the way that quantum computing is going to start opening up new opportunities for greater financial analysis, greater levels of insight beyond what conventional computers can do today, understanding how the back office is going to get completely transformed as a result of what blockchain is able to do, and being able to understand how to innovate from an incumbent perspective. It goes back to operating model, it goes back to differentiation, it goes back to core capabilities, stuff that we're all used to all the time, every time there's an operating model discussion. But going beyond the norm in terms of embracing the change and really being at the forefront of this level of disruption is pretty key, I think. So many banks I'm working with, they will have the main line of business and the banking organization, and then a separate innovation group. And the difficulty there is to really practically and productively seed innovation into the lines of business. So you almost want to move from being a bank plus an innovation group to being an innovative bank. And that's easy to say, but the operating model and the embracing of innovation and disruption into the existing lines of business, I think we all know the challenges. It's significantly difficult to get the attention of business for H2, if you like, year plus one kind of disruption when you have guys that are running to day-to-day P&Ls. So that challenge remains very difficult, but really mandatory to change to avoid the gradual into sudden kind of environment I was talking about. Part of that is also legacy DNA to digital DNA. I had a discussion with a market infrastructure client yesterday, and they were getting incredibly frustrated on how long it takes to affect change within the existing organization. New startup projects, blockchain and others, being able to use agile, use design thinking, be able to new releases every 2 weeks, whatever it may be, but then the core systems still suffering with 6-month change cycles. So how do you reconcile those two? Because you can't just survive on the external froth, if you like, around innovation without making major change to the inside. And it's not just around technology, it's about the way of thinking that even the legacy can be considered to be subject to this digital DNA. And then finally, just with the fintech examples, and I'm sure you're very familiar with a lot of this, but we have many, many poachers from the industry that are now gamekeepers in the fintech space. So they aren't standing still in terms of challenging the incumbency as well, which remains why we have such an interesting dynamic at the moment. A huge amount of opportunity, I think, for change. A great time to debate what the new model actually is. And I really thank you for your time and attention.
Okay, take some questions.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so this is your chance to actually be interactive now. So are there any questions for Keith? I'm sure there are, because thanks very much. Okay, I'll ask one question. You didn't mention regulation in there as one of the key drivers. So how do you see regulation driving some of the technology changes and shifts and dynamics that you just walked through?
Yeah, I didn't cover it in too much detail, largely because of time, but I think it obviously is really important. I mean, just to take the blockchain world, I mentioned CLS, obviously Fed regulated, so being able to work out how regulatory approval comes about for these complex new blockchain environments is a key factor. So, it has an enabling capability, I think. I mentioned the UK FSA are visiting Japan to see what's going on there at the moment. So I think there's a balance of the regulators facilitating and encouraging transformation in the interest of end investors at the end of the day. But obviously, from the point you're on, the regulatory burden is intense. We're all very familiar with the RegTech changes. There's obviously a huge amount of innovation going on there. And I've no doubt that a combination of, especially in the US, less tightening from a regulatory point of view with the ability for the technology to ease the burden is going to make things a little better over the short term. But I think the regulatory impact on new models is going to be really important. The positive thing, I think, is that there's still careful encouragement as to how those changes can come about.
Okay, one of the things that we on ISITC is the use of data in that whole area, and I'll be pleased to see how we can actually push that forward, that discussion, that debate, because historically it's been, can you send us a new report from the regulators, right? So everyone generates a new report rather than have some way in which you can use the same data in a data lake, for example, and shift that whole movement to just extrapolating that and pushing that through for the regulators. So I guess that's something that we would like to undertake as a group. Anybody else want a question? Don't be scared. Oh, marvellous. There's 2 questions here. Are we all live, Mr.?
Yes.
Yep. You're second. Okay.
So Keith, you paint a very innovative and interesting picture of the industry, which we can come on to debate in a moment actually, which I think we generally subscribe to. However, I think if we look at the industry today, it is mired in significant technology investment and debt over the last 50 years probably, and complex legacy environments and so on. I guess my question is 2-part. Who do you think really gets it? And how do you think, what would your advice be to organisations that, do perhaps have 1,200 applications that don't necessarily talk to each other, and how the best they can really migrate to a blockchain or an AI or the world that you've painted?
That's a good question, I think, and obviously difficult to answer in any convincing way. I mean, I think there are different choices that banks face. Do they, as we've seen some examples in Germany, Solaris and so on, do they try and build a new bank external to the existing infrastructure and put the investment into that on the basis that you will migrate your legacy environment into this new greenfield perspective? Obviously, there's a lot of cost, a lot of time, lots of complexity in doing that, but the big rainbow at the end of that particular journey, or go through incremental change on the legacy, which is what most firms would typically do. But the challenge obviously is, especially at the moment, and given what we said on regulation, a lot of the, as you know, the change the bank funding to actually incrementally improve the legacy is on the back of regulatory change. And now that some of the regulatory change parameters are lessening a little bit, FRTB is a good example, I would suggest, of with the pressure being off a little bit, then the risk is some debate in the press today, I think, about all the projects that have not taken place because of MiFID II beginning to get back on the agenda. But I think the change budgets aren't going to widely open up. There is going to be some challenges, I think, because the reg-driven transformation isn't going to happen at the same pace that it might have done previously. Yeah. So that's also a challenge. So there's no easy answer, as I said, but I think it's a real looking at all the options completely as opposed to just to take in the status quo around the small regulatory driven change around the legacy is the challenge.
If you could say your name and your company, that'd be fantastic before we ask questions.
Sure, Keith. Michael Cooper from BT.
Nice to meet you.
Two questions, I guess. One, you referenced a new industry model there, but you also referenced the work that's happening in Japan around blockchain, and I was kind of interested in what your perception was about where different regions, localities were in terms of innovation and development, and what the implications of that for a industry model. And the second one that just kind of popped into my head was the level to which innovation is starting to introduce systemic risk, perhaps around cyber and things like that. What your views were on that?
Yeah, I mean, on the latter point, I mean, it's obviously a consideration. I mean, if you look at the rankings that heads of business, heads of technology have for threats or risks, cyber obviously is very close to the top, if not the top. And obviously it's a key element of design of a lot of what I've been talking about, especially in the blockchain world. Obviously that's super critical. Also in quantum, because I didn't dwell on it, but one of the concerns about quantum is it means that RSA type of encryption is potentially exposed, because you can basically work out the factors of very large numbers, by which is one of the things quantum can do over time. However, there are a load of quantum-proof encryption approaches as well. So I think that's one point. On your broader perspective on how it varies by markets, I mean, Japan I think is really fascinating, because I think it's the only example globally where the industry has come together, facilitated by JPX in that particular case, to explore what the new models may be, with very active participation from, as I said, regulators, central bank, broker-dealers, the industry association, etc. And there aren't any other examples of that. And it's a very powerful exercise, I think, to build consensus, which is obviously culturally in tune with Japan as well. We're seeing, elements of that maybe with what ECB, for example, are, the post-T2S where some of those changes are evolving. But obviously there are much other challenges in Europe, and obviously US is a different environment again. So Japan, I think, is really fascinating as an example, and I think there's a lot to be learned by the other regions as to what's going on there to, slow and steady for sure, but, wide-ranging change as opposed to something which is more constrained and tactical.
Yeah, I'm Rajiv. I run a startup now. My question is on the blockchain stuff. I believe many of them are headline-grabbing stuff. DTCC and CLS, what sort of things are they doing on blockchain? And decentralization is one of the key aspects. The centralized players are playing this and saying that they're doing a blockchain project. It seems some sort of odd thing. Can you elaborate as to what have they achieved in blockchain?
Yeah, well, if I take the DTCC example, so obviously they're a central institution, but for the trade information warehouse, it's also a central database type of system that supports 95% plus of the world's credit default swaps. It's been implemented in 2 phases, which part as an example, I think, of answering your question. So it's being implemented in the first phase, which is essentially centralized distributed ledger. So basically, all the banks, Morgan Stanley, etc., that are trading have interactions with DTCC around their credit default swaps inventory. Essentially, that is being managed without any change to the banks themselves, i.e. the ledger is implemented just within DTCC, who are managing all of the nodes, and so all the interfaces are the same. Therefore, the migration to the new environment is relatively easy. So that's what's going live in the first instance this year. And then the second phase is to roll those nodes out from the DTCC to the individual banks. Now, that is interesting because it starts saving money for the banks as opposed to DTCC, so there's obviously a big focus on that. And the second point is that you then have a node within the bank's environment, which basically is a golden source of all the credit default swaps that they've traded with all their counterparties, and being in sync with what the DTCC's view of the truth is. So essentially it becomes a lightning conductor, if you like, to simplify and reduce all of the complexity that might exist within that bank for their post-trade environment for CDSs in that particular case. So my point being, whilst the DTCC is a central institution, the environment that will be produced at the end of the second phase will be fully distributed, and that then has a significant impact on the derivatives, OTC derivatives post-trade simplification that those individual banks can then realize because they have a single source, which is the golden copy. They no longer have to reconcile against other firms in the post-trade environment in terms of the processes, and that has impact in terms of application, simplification, etc.
Would it mean eventual dissolution of DTCC and CLS?
Sorry, what?
Dissolution of...
Evolution?
Removing
Dissolution.
of...
I don't think we're going to see any disintermediation, if that's what you mean, anytime soon, certainly for DTCC, because that's when the regulatory changes, the regulatory purview, if I understand the question properly, the systemically important nature of these institutions. I don't think that means we're going to see any significant change there. The services they offer, the changing market environment will change a bit, I think, but the role those institutions have for the purposes of financial stability, CLS supports $5 trillion every day of FX volumes. That's going to be an important part that nobody's going to want to play with. And in fact, everything that's going on with CLS in particular is outside of that core system. There's complete segregation because of the systemic important nature of that to all the other applications that are being built out from a blockchain point of view. Any other questions?
Oh, just one more, because then we've got 2 people in the room. Okay, we can take those.
Cliff Doughton, Sumi Trust. Do you see the early challenges of scalability being solved for blockchain and for quantum as well?
Well, blockchain is a much more short-term thing. So we're already, benchmarking at thousands of transactions per second. So that means, a lot of use cases in the post-trade world aren't a problem. But as soon as you get into the front office, then obviously scalability is a much bigger factor. But we're talking about technology which is still pretty new. I mean, 2 years ago, R3 didn't exist, Hyperledger project didn't exist. So the ramp, the gradient going on at the moment in terms of technical innovation is immense. So, we're already seeing, significant improvements in the main three technologies out there, which are Hyperledger Fabric, R3 Corda, and Ethereum Alliance, talking about in the private permission world. So, scalability is going at a pace, but already, using Fabric as an example, the volume capacity is perfectly good for that. And I think as we start seeing, new coin-based representations, which, is another development going on this year on ledgers, that's going to start facilitating D versus P kind of elements. And that will basically enable many more use cases. We wait to see what happens with the universal settlement coin as an example of that. So that will also be, I think, a fascinating change as we get more and more into the core of post-trade.
Okay, final question.
Hi, it's Johnny Spears from Torstone. Just back to your point about banks having to innovate and actually bring together the innovation part of their business and make that a core part of their DNA. Do you see possibly a threat from some of the more emerging markets where maybe they're not as burdened with technical and functional debt, and perhaps they have an ability to leapfrog their peers in the developed market and leverage new technology quicker?
Yeah, I think that's well observed, and I don't want to pick on one bank in particular, but if you look at DBS, for example, I think they're a good example of a bank, Asian, very innovative, probably done a better job of embracing innovation within the line of business, and you can see that, I think, through some of the initiatives that are going on there. So, for example, they've established I didn't talk about it in any detail in terms of RPA as another driver, but they've established a centre of excellence for RPA, which is driving that out across the business very successfully. So, it's not a research project in a lab. It really is ingrained into the business in a very productive and practical way. So I think there are banks like that are at the forefront of this. They may not have as much technology debt. They may have a different kind of regulatory agenda in that respect. But I think there's some good examples out there that set a benchmark to some of the more legacy incumbent banks as to how to approach it.
Thank you very much, Keith Bear. Thank you.